Hello everyone. In this lecture, we will learn about CSS Selectors. CSS Selectors. As the name indicates, CSS Selectors helps to select the elements that you want to style from the web page. There are 4 types of CSS Selectors. They are Element Selector, Class Selector, ID Selector and Universal Selector. Let me include the type of selectors in the comment. So what did I say? First is Element Selector, Class Selector, ID Selector and Universal Selector. Okay. Remember in the previous lecture we saw about the CSS syntax. Right, we learnt about the type of CSS, internal CSS, external CSS and inline CSS, and the syntax for internal CSS and external CSS are same. So here in line number 10, if you see the syntax is, we have a selector and then we have the declaration block. Right, in this CSS rule, H1 is a selector and this selector is called as Element Selector because this CSS rule will select all the H1 elements in the web page and apply the given style. Right, so this CSS rule will select all the H1 elements. So we have H1 element in line number 16 and line number 21. It will select these two H1 elements because there are only 2 H1 elements in the web page. So it will select these 2 H1 elements from the web page and it makes the text color red and background color yellow. Right? Okay. Here in this CSS rule we have used Element Selector. Element Selector means we use the element name as a selector. So next is Class Selector. Okay. Class Selector selects all the HTML elements from the page that has same value in the class attribute. That is, all the HTML elements with the same value in the class attribute will be selected. So we'll see this with an example. So I'm in line number 17. We have a H3 element and a paragraph element here. I'm going to use class attribute. Class is equal to, I'm going to give some name. This name can be anything. So I'm giving the name as my class. And I'm going to use the same class attribute for paragraph element, that is line number 19. See, we have used class attribute and the class name is same for both H3 element and paragraph element. So now I'm going to save this file and go to CSS. And in CSS we want the program to fetch all the elements that has class attribute equal to my class. Okay, so period and then the class name. So what is the class name that we have given? It's my class. In CSS file, we are going to define the styles for the class selector my class by using period and then class name and then comes the declaration block. I'm going to give some styles, text decoration, underline and font color red. So here the first property, text decoration property, is used to underline the text. So text decoration underline is like this CSS rule will be applied to H3 heading element and then paragraph element, and both the text, this is heading 3 and this is paragraph, both these text will be in color red and it will be underlined. Okay, let's go to the output. Here is our output. See, both heading 3 element and paragraph element has font color as red and both are underlined. Right, maybe let me change the font color to some other color. Everything is red here, right? So maybe I'll change it to what color? Purple. Save. So now heading 3 and paragraph, both these text are underlined and are in purple color. So by using class selector, we can apply same styling to different HTML elements. Next we'll look at ID selector. ID selector uses ID attribute instead of class attribute. Here we use ID attribute to an HTML element, and this ID selector selects one specific element. Difference between class attribute and class selector and ID selector is, class selector we can use the same class name to many elements. In this case we have used the same class name, my class, to H3 element and then paragraph element. But in the case of ID selector, we can use ID attribute only to a single element because ID is unique. Okay, ID of an element should be unique within the web page. And so ID selector is used to select one unique HTML element. Let's look at an example. We have two H1 heading, right? So for the second H1 heading, I am going to use ID attribute. So ID is equal to some name, my ID. Now we'll define the style for this ID selector in CSS file. So just like class selector's symbol is period or dot, and after that we'll write the class name. Just like that, similarly ID selector's symbol is hash. We write hash and then write the ID name, which in our case is my ID, right? My ID, it's defined for this H1 element. So I'm going to give some property here. Okay, here border is the CSS property. This statement, this CSS rule will add yellow color border with 2 pixels thickness around the element. Okay, let's check the output. Let me save the file. Here we have yellow background color, so yellow color border is not visible. Let me change the color of the border. So let me give it as brown. Save it and refresh the page. Now we can see the border around the second H1 element alone, only around the second H1 element. So that is only the element in line number 21 which has ID attribute set to my ID, that is affected, and it has a yellow border that is not yellow, it's a brown border of 2 pixels thickness drawn around it. Okay, so here if you notice there are 2 heading elements, and for both the heading elements the element selector CSS rule is applied, and only for this H1 element the ID selector rule is applied. So last selector that we are going to see is universal selector. Universal selector. What is universal selector? Universal selector, as the name indicates, universal, it selects all the HTML elements in a page. Okay, let me go to CSS file. The symbol for universal selector is star. So if we give star, I'm going to use a property called text align center. This will center the text of entire web page. So let's check the output. So all the heading elements, paragraph elements, all the text, everything is centered, right? That is because of the use of universal selector. Okay, so now we have seen 4 selectors: CSS selectors, element selector, class selector, ID selector, universal selector. Element selector selects, applies the style like CSS rule to all the element in the web page. So for example, the element is H1, all the H1 elements will be applied with this style. Class selector can be used on different elements. That is, we can have the same class name for a paragraph element and a H3 element and a H2 element. So for different elements we can have the same class name, and all the elements with the same class name will be applied with the style, given style. ID selector is to uniquely apply a style to a specific element. So you can have only one ID, that is you can the ID name should be unique. That is, if you have h1 ID is equal to my ID, then you cannot have the same ID name for, say, paragraph element. So you cannot have PID is equal to my ID because that is already taken. So ID name should be unique, and it is used to specifically select a particular element from the web page. And then your universal selector, symbol is star. It applies the style to all the elements in the web page. Okay, let's take a scenario now. What if the same selector is given with different declarations? Which property value pair will be applied to that element? Is that clear what I am asking? Okay, let's take the scenario where the h1 element selector is defined twice. We have in line number 10, we have one declaration, and below that I am going to use another declaration for this h1 element. h1 color gray and background color pink. We have two CSS rules for the same element h1. So which CSS rule will be applied in this case? Answer is whichever CSS rule is defined at the bottommost part will be given priority. So in this case, the second CSS rule will be applied to the h1 element. Let's check the output. Save the file and go to the output. See, all the h1 headings are in pink color background with gray color text. Right? So one important thing to remember is, if we have more than one CSS rule for the same selector, then the bottommost one will be given priority. And one more thing, we know inline CSS, right? We learned in the previous lecture. Inline CSS will be given more weightage when compared to internal or external CSS. Inline CSS will be given more weightage. So for example here, for the h1 element, we'll use inline style. So for the second h1 element, I am going to use inline CSS, apply inline CSS using style attribute. Style is equal to, I am going to set the background color. Some background color, aqua. In this case, line number 22 h1 element, for which we have applied the inline CSS style, it will be of the background color aqua, and it will not be of background color pink, because inline CSS will be given more priority and it will override the previous old styles. Let's check the output. So now we can see that the second h1 element is of the color aqua because of the inline CSS usage. Okay. So in this lecture, we learnt about CSS selectors, usage and priorities. In the next lecture, we will be looking at some basic CSS properties and values. Thank you.